Thank you. Is my audio clear?
Yes, ma'am. You are clear.
Okay. In case in between there's some disturbance in the connectivity, I'll re-log in.
Sure.
So last week we had started talking about grief and bereavement, and I think we ended up having a fairly meaningful session in general. So just to do a quick run through while we give people a chance to come into the room. We talked about how grief is a natural response to loss of any kind, not just death, and losses show up in different ways. We specifically focused on loss in the context of illness and the series of losses people experience as they go through the illness journey. We talked about the different frameworks of grief through the lens of the stages, and then we talked about Worden and his tasks framework, as well as mediators of mourning, sorry. And we also talked about the dual process model. Following that, we talked about the ways in which grief is experienced, how it is expressed, and how people adapt to losses, and the fact that the ways in which people express and experience grief ideally should be there should be congruence, but that's not always the case. Sometimes because of societal and cultural pressures, people are not allowed to express grief the way they experience it, and the kind of trouble that leads to. So today we're going to actually continue with the different ways in which grief manifests, and then we will go into bereavement and how do we support people who are experiencing bereavement. So quick check-in word with everybody, as is traditional now amongst us. How is everybody feeling? Is anybody feeling fragile? Is anybody feeling sleepy because of the big lunch they've had? So it'll give me a sense of where everybody's at and how we can take our breaks over the next 1.5 hours, because this is a session that might require some mini breaks as we go along. Okay, ready. Rachel, glad to hear it. Cameras on if possible, please, just so that we have a more humanizing sort of interaction with one another for a little while at least. Thanks, Karthik. And yeah, and it's perfectly okay on a Friday afternoon to be lying down and listening to the session, although my teachers always told me it's better to be sitting upright if you want to absorb information. But all right, okay. So last time the session we stopped at the section on disenfranchised grief, and disenfranchised grief is grief that is not supported in society, either because the relationships are not recognized, they're not known about, or because they are relationships that are disapproved of. The manner in which somebody has died is not approved in the sense of overdosing, suicide, etc. And so there are various ways in which people get disenfranchised. And I did end by saying that one of the high risk groups for disenfranchised grief are people in the helping professions like medicine and healthcare and mental health, because we are taught in our training not to get attached to the people that we're trying to help. But I think that paradigm is also shifting quite a bit. So today, let's get started right up with the next part, which is also a bit of it's a big one. We're going to talk about complicated grief. We didn't touch upon complicated grief last time, did we? Sinead? No? All right. Okay. Sorry. I'm just checking because I've been teaching these grief and bereavement classes a while. I'm a little confused sometimes where we stopped off. All right. So complicated grief is something that I think all of us need to attune ourselves to, because especially in the wake of the global pandemic that we experienced, complicated grief is now far more common than it would have otherwise been. And what is complicated grief? So would someone here like to just volunteer to read out this slide? Anybody? You can unmute yourselves and read out the slide. This is also a wakefulness check that I'm going to be doing from time to time, because post lunch sessions are very hard to stay awake. Anybody? Unless I have to. I'm not above like just calling out names. Pradeep, Aarti, Anasuya, any one of you? Mohini. Senior, I think we're in trouble, Senior. Come on, anybody. Let's get this off.
Hi, ma'am. May I read?
Yes.
Come on, Amika, let's go for it. All right.
Complicated grief, characterized by intense and persistent yearning or longing for the deceased, difficulty accepting the death, persistent feelings of disbelief or shock, emotional numbness or detachment, difficulty experiencing positive emotions, difficulty engaging in activities that were previously enjoyed, guilt or self blame related to the death, intense feeling of anger or bitterness, difficulty trusting others or forming new relationships, preoccupation with thoughts of the deceased, difficulty with daily functioning such as work, school, or self care.
Thank you, Anamika. So, on the outset, it might seem like complicated grief is like any other grief. Like when you've just experienced a loss, any number of these things that you see on your screen at the moment could be a feature of how you're experiencing your loss, right? But for when grief is well experienced normally, yes, you might go through all these experiences, but it happens in an acute phase for a short phase, and then people slowly, as the dual process model tells us, or as Worden's tasks tell us, we move on. We start orienting ourselves to getting back to re-engaging with life. But the problem with complicated grief is that that doesn't happen. People stay stuck. They're stuck in all of these things. And they're unable to function. They're unable to engage with other people. And they don't move on through the various stages that normally people might go through, and they might get stuck in this sense of anger, bitterness, guilt, and acceptance of the reality of the loss is not there. Now, if you look back on the COVID pandemic, um, a lot of people that might have, over a period of time exhibited this once they've lost somebody. And part of the reason for that is, complicated grief is triggered by certain things. One could be the nature of the relationship with the deceased person. Maybe it was a completely enmeshed relationship. Maybe the person depended on the deceased for everything, for day-to-day decision making, for just taking care of them, for nurture, for whatever. They had fixated on that one person, and without that person they find that they're unable to function, they're unable to navigate the world. The second is the circumstances of the death. How did the person die? And if you look at the mediators of mourning, was it a sudden death? Was it an expected death? Was it a prolonged painful death? Was it an overdose? Was it somebody taking their own lives? Now, if I'm going to put it in the context of COVID, the circumstances of people's death was very, very unusual in that sense. Someone would come down with some symptoms like a cough, or like some cold-like symptoms, a fever, etc. And if you remember the Delta wave, very, very quickly that would just escalate into a serious condition. And then before you know it, the person is taken away, the rest of the family is in isolation, you're not allowed to visit the person. And then somebody, if you're lucky, somebody from the healthcare system is keeping you up to date about what is happening. For a lot of people, that didn't happen. They weren't getting updates also because the healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. People were wearing masks, and suddenly you got the news that the person had passed away, and that's it. And you can't even go for a funeral. You can't organize, what would have been normal in when somebody in the family died, because of all the norms at the time that we weren't allowed to be present as communities, as families, for the funerals, for the cremations, for the burials, or whatever are the rituals of mourning that we went through together. So circumstances of the death, and suddenly this person has disappeared from your life without you even expecting it. Yeah, so that's in the context of COVID. But in non-COVID, like I said, it could have been a sudden death that was not expected. Uh, in the nature of relationship, for a lot of people who've lost their children, they end up having complicated grief because it's very, very hard to accept the death of a child. Events that occurred after the death. What events occurred after the death? Now, events that occurred after the death could be conflict within the family because there was no will. Things that seemed to be safe were now threatened in terms of security. Some people might find that, they're completely cut out. They no longer have a place to live. There might be massive arguments in the family because of property issues. It could be that, that person was the one who managed all the finances, and suddenly there's a whole lot of debts and loans and things like that the rest of the family had no idea about. And how many of us know people who've experienced that kind of trauma after somebody has died, where suddenly they're being faced with all these crazy bills and things which they're supposed to clear off, and lack of social support. And again, that was something that was a hallmark of COVID, because we weren't able to be around the people who could have given us some sort of solace and support at a time when we were experiencing tragic losses. And when complicated grief occurs, and this is for a prolonged period of time, that all those, the previous slide, what was listed, this feeling of numbness, or feeling of anger, of unable to function, unable to make decisions, all of that, it starts to overshadow and dominate your life. And you are unable to do anything else. And chronic grief, now called prolonged grief disorder, same as complicated grief, has found its place in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 2020 after COVID hit. People who work in the mental health field recognize that we had this pandemic, but what is following is an epidemic of complicated grief. So even now, if you were to look around your own, communities, you might find that there are people who've never gotten over it and who are simply unable to re-engage with life because of the way things happen. There were people who had multiple losses at that time, and multiple losses together can also complicate the grieving process tremendously. So complicated grief, there is a lot of literature out there about complicated grief. My job today is to just place it on the table. And for those of you who are interested, just a Google search on PubMed or whatever will tell you there's a lot of research been done around complicated grief. Okay, now it's very easy to confuse grief and depression. And this is a big problem because very often, especially in palliative care, we end up misdiagnosing grief as depression because a lot of the symptoms map the same way. Okay, and they have several common characteristics, and these common characteristics include this intense sadness, fatigue, sleep and appetite disturbances, low energy, loss of pleasure, difficulty concentrating, and overwhelming emotions that interfere with a person's ability to cope with everyday stressors. Something that you could have otherwise, it's a normal stressor, you've had a puncture on the road. For some people, that one stressor will just completely undo you. And it seems like almost like a disproportionate response to something that is otherwise a fairly common stressor. And our reactions to those stressors become very, very pronounced. Is there a difference between grief and suffering? Okay, so Mona, I'm going to take that question in the end because that's a big question. Okay, so we're going to talk about that in the end, and I'm going to ask Senia to please remind me to come back to that question. Thank you for that question, Mona. Now, grief versus depression. Grief, this is the difference. Grief is specifically triggered by the loss of a person. In the context of palliative care, we're talking about that. Or it could be an event triggered by the loss of a marriage. It could be the loss of a pet. It could be the loss of a home. It could be anything. But there is a specific trigger for that grief to start. And even as we're experiencing grief, initially we might withdraw and stuff, but we remain connected to at least some people. For some people, it might be family members. For others, it might be a trusted friend. Some people look to their spiritual leaders, but there is a sense of connection with someone else. Okay. And periodically, the person might experience pleasure even, and you might laugh, and you might get together and do something that actually brings a smile to your face. You're able to go back to maybe cooking if that's something that you enjoy, and so on. And eventually, in small ways and big ways, the person starts to rebuild their lives. And usually the treatment for grief is grief focused therapy, if that is something that the person needs and needs help with. Depression, on the other hand, is a mental health disorder that could be triggered by any number of factors, and those factors may not be tangible or clear. It's the person who's experiencing the depression cannot put their finger on what is it that is causing them to feel this way. Okay. And there is a loss of connection and an inability to connect with other people or to experience even brief moments of pleasure. People completely in depression, they're not able to experience that kind of joy. They might put up a facade, like, it's very hard to tell when somebody is depressed, but very often, if you see them on their own, they're not experiencing that. They might put up a front to, for the sake of others, but are they genuinely able to feel that joy and authentic connection? It's very, very, very rare. And when depression goes on for a while, it might need a combination of therapy with medication. And I am not really a proponent of antidepressants in that sense, unless it is indicated. But for cases of depression, that to restore that sort of chemical balance is very essential, to get a psychiatrist involved and to bring some medication into the picture with a lot of care. It's not about just going and putting out one whole arm's length worth of drugs. It is very important to address the symptoms and the underlying condition, and it's only through talk therapy, through various whatever that school of thought might be, to really combine therapy with that medication and not just treat the symptoms of it with medication. And very often, if left untreated or unrecognized, even grief can show up in very unhealthy and pathological ways. And in some people, it might show up as serious disease or psychosomatic origins. Okay, so I'm grieving. There's nobody to recognize my grief, or I'm not getting the kind of social support that I need. My chores are piling on, my responsibilities are piling on. I'm not getting time to really process what Worden said, to process the pain of that grief. I'm not getting time to do it. And it might result in something like an illness. And again, psychosomatic, we've talked about it. People believe that a lot of the times it's in people's heads, but the mind and body are so connected that intense grief can manifest in the form of physical illness. And people who have not been supported properly through their grief often get stuck in a particular stage. They keep going back to feeling angry. They keep going back to this sense of denial, or they might end up, feeling guilty about what they could have done, what they shouldn't have done, etc. And it can then become complicated grief. In a lot of people, especially young people and young children who don't have the vocabulary to express their loss, it might show up in their behavior. And also in adults, not just in young children, but also in adults. And what are behaviors of self-sabotage? High-risk behaviors, no longer caring about your own safety, driving at high speed, substance use. Those are all self-sabotaging behaviors. If you've lost a person who's very close to you, you might start testing the boundaries of your other relationships. Are you really going to stay with me? There's this meme, or it's become a meme. There was a saying, but it's now almost become a meme where people say, if you can't handle me at my worst, then you don't deserve me at my best, sort of thing. People will test those boundaries, and that ends up in a lot of relationships also falling apart. Suicidal ideation or attempt, this can happen in a proportion of the bereaved, where they might seriously contemplate suicide, or they might even attempt it. And it could be because of practical reasons, it could be because of financial reasons, it could be because of emotional reasons, it could be a result of various things. And this inability to get that kind of help and support when people are grieving and it's unresolved, it stays unresolved, no one is talking you through those difficult emotions or even helping you through the practicalities of it, it can, in some people, lead to suicidal attempt or ideation. And for a lot of people, when they haven't resolved their grief, it might lead to alterations in their style of living. The hygiene levels might drop. People who really, looked after their appearance suddenly don't care about their appearance anymore. People who are very organized and took pride in being, keeping their homes organized suddenly don't care about it. Cleanliness levels, uh, you know, not showing up to work, things like that. So a marked alteration, the way they eat, the way they, their nutrition levels, they're not caring about that much. So there's a marked alteration in the style of living. And disruption of important relationships could be a result of any one of the above points as well, like I said. So people who are unable to express or articulate their grief and therefore are unable to get the help, important relationships might fall away. There might be genuinely caring people around them, but because this person is stuck and is acting out or is suicidal or is just not picking themselves up, there are some relationships that might get disrupted by it and fall away. Now, how to assess grief? I'm not going to take you through all of these in detail. What I can do is I can share a note with you. These are all validated tools to assess grief. And what I'll do is, along with the PowerPoint presentation, I'll send you a little note on all of these things so you can check them out. Some of them have the number of questions they ask is different. Some of them are more semi-structured. Some of them are more quantifiable. So you can check out any of these and see what will help you best in your practice. Now, how do we manage grief? Very important. Education. Education. What's happening now? We're talking about grief. We're being educated about grief. How to recognize what grief might look like in somebody. It doesn't look the same in everybody. What are the mediators of mourning? We now know what questions to ask somebody that we're trying to help out. And education even to the family in question, that to tell them that what they're experiencing is normal and it is expected and it's okay to feel the way they're feeling. If they're feeling vulnerable, it's okay to express it. Counseling is a tried and tested method. I can tell you, I see a therapist every week, and it has given me a lot of, at a very deep level, it has allowed me to process whatever it is that I'm experiencing. And I cannot underscore enough the value of a good counselor at a point like this. Now, in the Western countries, you have people who are specifically trained in grief management, but any good counselor will be able to also help you navigate this terrain, depending on the kind of person that you are or the kind of person that you're trying to help. Some people need to be directed. Some people need to just express their emotions and to find a place to talk about what they're going through and to have it normalized, or to some people need practical tips in how to cope better, in how some of them might have destructive coping mechanisms, how to minimize those. So counseling is very important. And support groups, in some cases, it helps, especially if people have experienced similar kinds of losses. So for example, in our children's program, we did have a few support groups for mothers of children with various conditions like renal failure or, Down syndrome or things like that. And that went a long way in helping these parents find support in people who have lived experience. I, as a palliative care provider, I'm still limited in experiences that I have, and I may not be able to fully empathize with somebody in exactly what that loss has meant to them. But then somebody else who's gone through that loss might be able to provide that sort of mentoring and that kind of support. And in some cases, pharmacotherapy, medication becomes important, especially when there are massive disruptions to your physical sense of well-being and your ability to function. So pharmacotherapy is indicated in cases of extreme grief, especially complicated grief. Now, certain psychological intervention frameworks that we use, and those of you who are trained in psychology might recognize these. Cognitive behavior therapy is a very well-known phrase, and it's the kind of therapy that focuses on identifying changing negative thought patterns that might be contributing to feelings of grief and loss. And so cognitive behavioral therapy, as the name suggests, addresses your cognition around your experience and how that translates into your behavior. And usually these are very directive sort of sessions where a trained therapist will actually help you reorder your thoughts in a way that you're not contributing to this prolonged experience of grief and loss beyond what is healthy. Mindfulness-based interventions, and these are interventions that are aimed to promote acceptance and the present moment awareness to reduce stress and to improve emotional regulation. Now, for a lot of people, doing a task becomes very, very therapeutic. Like they don't want to sit and talk about the emotion. And again, remember, intuitive versus instrumental, right? So you have to really find out whether the person you're trying to help is someone who's willing to talk about their emotions, but also be mindful that they're not getting stuck in the talking about it. Some people get stuck talking about it over and over and over again, which might be leading to their recurring thoughts and those patterns, just reinforcing what they're going through. Mindfulness-based interventions, I personally found in my case to be very therapeutic, and mindfulness-based interventions can be creative. It can be from the creative arts. I have a friend who is an art therapist, and she just came home and she told me to start painting a wall with flowers. And I said, I've never painted a wall in my life. I haven't painted anything in my life. I don't consider myself an artistic person. But she guided me through it. And I wish I had a picture to show you, but then there's this wall in my mother's house where she got me to start painting. And she said, every time you feel anxious or you feel an anxiety attack coming on, or if you feel like, you're spiraling into some sort of a grief spiral, why don't you just go and paint a flower? And I have to tell you that by the end of the month, there were over 30 flowers on that wall. But that mindfulness-based practice of sitting down, focusing on the art actually really helped a lot, because it helped me still my thoughts and actually focus my attention somewhere else. So it had a calming physiological effect on me. And sometimes that is what is needed to stop this spiraling out from happening. And so mindfulness-based interventions can help. Please also remember that not everybody is cut out for things like mindfulness-based meditation. Sometimes people do not want to go inwards at that point, or going inwards might actually make things worse. So you want to bring them out and make them focus on a task outwards that is soothing, calming, that has no goal in mind in that sense. Narrative therapy, and this is a therapy that focuses on exploring and reshaping the story we tell ourselves. And this is actually a beautiful way. I personally believe that storytelling is a very, very powerful tool. And all of us are protagonists in our stories. We have a role that we play in our stories. I am so-and-so. My mother was this kind of person. So what are some of the stories that we tell ourselves? Can I just stop sharing for a second? Because I'm particularly interested in where storytelling lands for everybody. So what are some of the stories that, it doesn't have to be your story particularly right now, but what are some of the stories you've heard people tell about themselves and about their families? And if any of you could turn your cameras on, that'll be great, because I'm just looking at a series of black tiles at the moment. Okay, so what are some of the stories we tell ourselves, or you've heard people tell themselves? I'll give you a hint, okay? Stories about hard work. Okay, fine. I'm a survivor. I have gone through so many losses in my life. I have survived a lot. I know what hardship is. Yeah, survival stories. So people start pegging themselves as survivors. Okay, there might be others who might say, no, my job is to keep the family together. That's my job. There might be a man who might have faced a loss as a young boy and was told that he's the man of the house. That's his story in his head. I'm the man of the house. I have to look after everybody. I have to provide. This is a script. And the more we tell ourselves the story about ourselves, the stronger that role becomes. So there's this beautiful book, I don't know, some of you, especially women, might have read it. It's called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And there's this really beautiful part where she says, when do we stop becoming survivors and start to thrive? It's when we stop calling ourselves survivors. Yes, self-pity stories. Yeah. So stories of, my family has always had it so rough, but we overcame all odds. Not all stories are negative stories. Some stories are powerful stories of strength. This is a family that has come through so much, and we're strong people. We come from a line of very, very happy-go-lucky people who are able to face anything, but women who run with the wolves. Rachel, that's the name of the book. So the stories we tell ourselves, if that story has a particular role that you play in it, and you keep on, rehashing that same role, you're not going to get out of that role. That is your role. So narrative therapy helps you to reshape your story. And a good narrative therapist will make you revisit parts of your story and rewrite your script. And that is a great way sometimes to get out of this rut that we find. Why does this always happen to me? Why does this always happen to me? I'm always getting into terrible relationships. People are always abandoning me. Okay, so there are different styles. I'm not saying any one of these CBT, narrative therapy, mindfulness-based interventions, not any one of them is better than the other. But you have to know what works for you and to mix and match these different therapies. And it's particularly useful in managing grief or to reorient yourself to grief and loss and then re-engaging with life. Okay. Acceptance and commitment therapy. I have to confess that I don't know a lot about this particular intervention, but this is one of the therapies that have come up in the literature of grief management. And it really encourages people to accept their feelings of grief while also taking action towards goals. Now, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking that actually my therapist has been doing this with me because, when I say I'm so angry, shouldn't I be feeling something else by now? No, it's okay. It's fine. Forgive yourself for feeling angry. It's okay. It's fine. Let's work with that anger to move. What do you want to do for yourself next? So accepting yourself, and sometimes accepting the feelings, especially when those are negative feelings, is very, very difficult. So acceptance and then committing to act from that point and towards betterment for where you're at is ACT therapy. Trauma-focused therapies, a lot of people might need this because, especially for individuals who have experienced traumatic grief, such as a sudden or violent loss of a loved one, or the fact that it was a very traumatic relationship to begin with, and the death itself has left a lot of trauma wounds and the person is experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. It might be that the process of the illness was so traumatic that multiple surgeries went wrong or horrible things happened at the hospital. And, towards the end of it, everybody in the family is traumatized. So a lot of people who have gone through a difficult illness journey will have feelings of trauma and post-traumatic stress that need to be worked through with a trauma-informed person. Okay, so the choice of framework really depends on your individual specific needs and also the therapist's expertise and training. Now, if I am not adept at ACT, I should not attempt to do it by reading a couple of books about it, because the dissonance between my training, my personality, and what I'm trying to do will come through. There is something called REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which really challenges a person's way of thinking. So if someone is saying, I'm feeling suicidal, an REBT specialist might say, why haven't you done it yet? But if I'm not a confrontational person, I will not be able to pull that off. And if I use it on a person who's not good with confrontation, I can cause more damage. So you have to be very careful in the intervention that you choose. One size does not fit all. Please go through the mediators of mourning. And you might find that at different times in the journey, the person needs different things. So make sure that you're able to pivot according to what the person needs and not just impose your framework on, no, we are going to go through the 4 tasks that Worden laid out. No, sometimes you can't do that. Okay. So grief counseling goals, irrespective of the framework that you choose, is firstly to increase the reality of loss. And when I say that, I don't mean that in a cruel way. It's to, maybe a better way of putting it is to help the person accept the reality of loss. Okay. And it could be small things like, hey, how about we clean up that person's room now? Are you ready to start donating their clothes to charity? Maybe there are things that we say, okay, how about we now go and, close that bank account? Things like that. So it's to increase the reality of the loss and to say, it has happened and I'm going to help you slowly accept that the reality, that the loss is real. To help the bereaved deal with both the experienced and the latent effects. So on the surface, I might say, yeah, sure, of course, and I'll tell you, like for me, I was my mother's primary caregiver for years years, not just months. And of course, it became like my primary role in life for the last 5-6 months of her life. And so on the surface, it was like, yes, of course, I've got all the palliative care doctors. I know the decision-making process. I know that at this point, we're not going to take her to the hospital. We're going to take care of her at home. And I'm okay with this. And I found that I was explaining that to my entire family, and I came across as this competent person. But the latent effect I later realized was that I had some bitterness about it. I had uncertainty about the course that I had taken. I had unresolved issues of, the fact that my mom died when I was not there. I felt angry that, after all of that time, I had that experience. And so my counselor has been great in that sense, where she's helped me also say, okay, let's talk about what you're not talking about. Let's talk about things that you're omitting. Okay, when you talk about this, I find that you're constantly talking about, how supportive everyone else has been around you. But let's talk about the fact that how supported did you actually feel at that time, or if you feel like you're still doing the heavy lifting. So to help the bereaved deal with both the experienced and expressed, as well as the latent effect of the loss. To help the bereaved overcome impediments to readjustment. I might be self-sabotaging. I had basically locked myself into that house and said, no, I have to, have all these things to take care of. I have the dogs to take care of. I have to secure the house. I have to make sure the people who work here are taken care of, etc., etc. And for all practical purposes, I had just stayed over there, refusing to re-engage with the rest of my life for a certain period of time. And it was actually, again, it was through good counseling that I was encouraged to finally leave that space and come back to where I live and to re-engage with life on my own terms. And basically, in that sense, it was an impediment, because my thought process had gotten stuck saying, no, I cannot do anything till I do this. So those kind of ways in which a person might say, okay, what is the worst case scenario? What will happen if you actually just leave everything right now to handle itself and you carry on? And I said, no, my God, everything is going to fall apart. But did everything fall apart? No, it didn't. So my own thought process was an impediment to me moving on and readjusting. For other people, it might be other things. The fear of living alone. Maybe some people need to move homes because everything in this current house or this flat reminds them of that person who they died, who had died. So helping the bereaved overcome impediments to readjustment, and to encourage the bereaved to make healthy emotional withdrawal from the deceased and reinvest energy into other relationships. And these are not necessarily, this is not that you're replacing the person, but a lot of people feel guilty that they're moving on, that, especially like spouses who've lost their partners, they might find that they're unable to move on to another relationship. For others, it might be something different. So to really encourage the bereaved to make a healthy emotional withdrawal from the deceased and reinvest energy into other relationships and say, hey, you know what? Now that your parent has passed on, how about you pay more attention to your relationship with your siblings? Because they've also experienced this loss. How about you guys do something together that is not about, your unwell parent? And again, for me, it was that every time my brother and I spoke, it was always about my mother's health. And it was like, I think I've mentioned it where Dr. Raj said, Smriti, you better start talking about something else with your brother. Otherwise, you guys are going to have nothing to talk about once she's gone. So we did work on that relationship. And that has actually been a very, very important factor in dealing with the grief and moving on. And most people, again, I'm not going to say it's a hard and fast thing, but most people resolve to a level of functioning around 1 year later. Some individuals and families might need more time simply because of practical reasons, or because the families living apart, or conversations need to be had, or there are other logistical issues or legal issues that need to be taken care of. And I think this is important for all of us. We all of us need to advocate for sufficient time off from work for the bereaved, especially in the first few weeks of bereavement. Now, I would even go a step further to say that, yes, in the first couple of weeks, especially when it's a close loved one who has died, you need that time to really take care of practical issues and, the funeral and the prayers and this and that. But I would say that, maybe a couple of months down the line or sometime around then, having a week off from work just to then process that emotion could be a very helpful thing, because it's only after that period of taking care of immediate legal issues, financial issues, rearranging your living space, etc., when you finally may need some time to just really at a spiritual level come to terms with the loss that you've had. So I would say let's all advocate for bereavement leave, maybe a week soon after the passing of somebody, and maybe a week later where it is paid leave, where the person has the ability to then really attend to their difficult emotions and feelings. And what you really need to remember and remind people that you're helping is that grief spikes can continue for the rest of your life. And like I said before, you grow around the grief doesn't recede. And especially around special events, holidays, anniversaries, people have more acute reactions, or they might feel the loss more strongly at those times. And that's perfectly normal. It's perfectly normal. Okay. So now we're going to talk about bereavement, although we've already talked about certain aspects of bereavement in talking about grief, but I'm going to talk about the process of bereavement. Bereavement is it's a time of intense suffering, and this is when the actual event has happened where the person has died. The event of that death is basically what bereavement is for the rest of the family, and or not just family, for friends as well. And this is a time where people might have impaired interpersonal and social relationships, and they're unable to really, function normally. And this is also a time which is associated with elevated risks to mental health, morbidity, and mortality. People tend to get sick. They tend to have things. They tend to have mental health issues. Now, this could also be a function that while you're in that caregiving mode, you're keeping yourself in check, and all your energy is directed to the person that you're caring for. And it happens when you've gone through a period of prolonged stress, and suddenly that period has come to an end. Your body just gives out. And you might have experienced this in other situations where you've been working night and day on a project or towards a deadline. The minute it's over, you go home and you just, either you get sick, or you get a cold, or you just sleep or whatever. And it's also a time when mental health issues might surface, like anxiety, panic, those kind of things. And like I said, PTSD might then emerge as a mental health condition at that point. And 10 to 20% of any population has a difficult time integrating the loss into their lives. So this is, I think, again, pre-pandemic statistics. Those statistics, if we really do a survey, might have changed by now. Now, what are some of the emotions that we feel at the time of somebody's death? What are some of the emotions? Okay, I see that there are more. Rachel, I made a note of your question. I'll come to that later. What are some of the emotions that you feel at the time of bereavement? Loss of purpose. Okay. What else? Guilt, sadness. Anything else? What else? Emptiness. Lost. Yeah, not accepting reality. So that's denial. Okay. So one, of course, is intense sadness. That could be a common response at the time of bereavement when somebody dies. Nobody has said anger, but anger could very well be an emotion that you feel at the time of bereavement. Numbness. Somebody said empty, numbness, feeling lost. Yeah. Disbelief. Yeah. Some people just panic. They have extreme bouts of anxiety and panic. Some people, and again, this is not something that has been mentioned in the chat box yet. Relief that it is over. And that relief in and of itself can lead to a sense of feeling guilty. You might feel guilty anyway because of the way the person and because of the treatment, because of various reasons. I should have done this earlier. I should have gotten them checked. I should have done this. Could we have done something different? But for a lot of people who've been caregivers for a long period of time, or even an intense period of time, they're like, oh, especially when the person has suffered a lot, there is a lot of relief that it's over. And do we as a society allow the expression of grief? Thank God it's finished. Don't say that. You don't mean it. Whatever it was a difficult time, but at the end of the day, she was your mother. No, I am genuinely relieved it's over because I don't want to see her suffer. And honestly, for me, I did not have any more energy or reserves left in me. Okay, so these are just a bunch of, and of course, between all of these emotions, you could feel some in-between emotions. So there is no template for grief. There is no template. Nobody can tell you what your grief can look like. It can look absolutely messy, or it can go by textbook. Yeah. Now, following the death, there is the immediate loss of the person itself. And after that, there are secondary losses. Oh, I was a caregiver for 6 years. Now what am I? I've lost my role. This was my meaning and purpose in life. And now what do? I gave up job opportunities. I gave up so many things. My marriage fell apart, and now what? You might have struck up a really warm, close relationship with your caregiving team. And now there's no reason for them to hang around you anymore. So that's also, they slowly sort of zoom out of your life. And then there are further losses of like hopes, dreams, income, roles within the family, so on and so forth. And each of these requires adjusting and adapting. Okay. There is something to be said also of the fact that, and the secondary losses, I want to spend a little bit of time on secondary losses. What are some of the secondary losses that people could face on the death of a loved one? Some of the secondary losses could be the loss of, the person in the family who always sorted out fights. It could be the loss of the person who always knew what to do in a crisis. It could be the fact that, that was the person who handled all the finances and now you don't have a clue. It could be the parent who did all the, specific roles with the child, and now you have to do it. And you don't know how to do it. You don't know where to start. And I've seen a lot of, young parents when a spouse has died, the remaining parent has no clue about certain aspects of, okay, I'm going to now have to sit down. This was his role, but now I'm going to sit down and have to do homework with this child, right? For some people, okay, so those are roles. For some people, it might be a loss in status. Maybe it was the person who died who actually was the person who held societal status. And now with that person gone, that status is gone. It could be the loss of a home because of maybe tremendous financial burdens and difficulties that you've spent all your life savings on the treatment. And now you have to move houses, you have to move to a place or you have to change your lifestyle, you have to change certain things you have to get a job that you absolutely dislike. So there are lots of these changes that happen. So loss of hopes, loss of dreams, loss of opportunity, things that you might have wanted to do that you can no longer do. I might feel like, okay, now I have to go move into that house and start looking after that house because it is ancestral property. So earlier my plan was to travel, but now I can't do that. I have these other responsibilities. Feelings of loss of a secure future. Yes, thank you very much. That's a very big one. You've lost your sense of, certainty of what's going to happen next. Okay. So there are various secondary losses that people experience, and those all, if we are to help them, we really need to pay attention to what those secondary losses are to that bereaved person. Now, there are some protective factors. Protective factors means that these are good things. So please look out for these. The person who has been bereaved, do they have social support? within the family or the community or both? What are their coping styles like? Do they have healthy coping styles, which includes personality traits? And here, a word of caution against toxic positivity. Everything will be okay, don't worry, everything's no. Let's avoid that. Let's go by what the person who we are helping, what their positive coping strategies are. Some people might throw themselves into work. That's fine, but is it being overutilized? Is it being pathologically utilized? So are they looking out actively for help from a counselor? Are there people that support them in practical ways? So these are healthy coping styles. Resilience is the ability to bounce back. And this is different for different people. It is an overused word, in my opinion. Resilience is not something that just is inherent. Resilience comes from constantly experiencing difficult situations. Resilience, some people have a predisposition to being resilient, but resilience only emerges after crises. Okay, so someone has gone through a lot of difficulties and has been resilient. That is a strength, but that is not a cop out. We can't say, oh, look, you've been so resilient in the past, you can get through this. Resilience is a good thing, but it also needs nurturing. Okay, their ability to communicate. Now, this is across ages. Is it a child who's not able to tell you what this loss means to them? Is it a person who has never had a voice within the family, like maybe the daughter-in-law who was very, by the end of the caregiving exercise, was very attached to the person who died? Is it the historically quiet sibling? Okay, is it the person with the introverted personality? So, so the ability to communicate and to encourage that communication in whatever style or form it might be. You might need to resort to art. You might need to resort to their style, and you have to always approach a person in the way that they're most comfortable communicating. And this even goes to language, vernacular language versus Hindi or English or the dominant language, getting a translator. Appropriate and timely healthcare responses. Now, if the family received the right kind of healthcare and the right kind of, they had faith in the healthcare system and all of that, then bereavement becomes a little bit easier. Yes, we did all the right things. Yes, the doctors explained everything. When we needed them, they came. We had the palliative care team. The pain was managed, etc., etc. So these things actually go towards better outcomes in bereavement later. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on anger, which is a particularly difficult emotion that is experienced sometimes at bereavement. And as a society, we don't encourage people to express anger because we find anger to be a very menacing sort of um, emotion. And we don't have space for somebody to express that anger. What are you angry about? I mean, come on, like the person has died. Well, now what are you angry about? And it could be for 100 different reasons. But our tendency is to not go there because it's uncomfortable for us. Okay. But it is actually a powerful emotion, which if it is used correctly can actually help somebody cope better. But if it is pushed down and repressed and said, oh, we can't talk about it, it can actually manifest in terrible ways if we're not helping the person cope with it. And some of these emotions, especially angry emotions towards people who are dead, it's easier to idolize the dead than it is to talk about their faults and their flaws. Just because a person has died doesn't make them a saint. They were human beings. They might have done some horrible things. They might have made you feel terrible. There might be a lifetime of a complicated, conflicted relationship. But come on, you don't speak ill of the dead. How many times have we heard that, right? So when people don't have that safe space to express their anger, it can manifest in a multitude of ways. It could be just them feeling hurt and misunderstood. It could result in silent grudges, guilt, overreaction, explosive outbursts, disproportionately, impaired social functioning, social withdrawal, depression, just apathy, low self-esteem. It could result in any number of those things. So we have to be very careful. If somebody has expressed, or if you sense that somebody is angry, give them that space and say, you don't have to say, I think you're angry. No, say that, in a lot of situations, sadness and love and those kind of emotions are not the only emotions we're left with. We're sometimes left with difficult emotions like anger, and people find it hard to talk about. But I want you to know that if there's ever something that you feel that you cannot talk about to your family, maybe you might want to talk to me about it, and leave the door open. Okay, so somebody may not want you to outright come and say, I can see that you're angry, because they themselves have internalized this idea that being angry is a bad thing. Okay, so open the door, let them know that there is a safe space, and let them express their anger, and know how to be ready on how to manage that anger, because sometimes it comes out in explosive ways. Yeah. Now, when providing bereavement support, first of all, identify and support their healthy coping strategies. Yes, this is a person who likes to write and journal, and so yes, that's a good coping strategy. There is somebody who might want to start looking after themselves. I need to get fit and I need to get healthy, so I'm going to now start. That's how I'm going to cope. Identify and reduce risk factors. Now, the risk factor might be that they don't have social support. Can we mobilize better social support? Identify a risk factor like, okay, they have been left with a massive financial debt, which is going to cause them some serious emotional distress and social distress. Is there any way in which we can at least acknowledge that, okay, I see that you're going through this tough time, and try and get them actual practical advice? I had this wonderful group of people from, we run a program called Arohan, which is, the participants are people with lived experience. And one of them was a banker. And some of you might have seen that webinar where it was actually ironic. Just before my own bereavement, 2 weeks before that, we had done a webinar on, okay, what are some of the things that we need to take care of in the aftermath of someone's death? And it had everything from bank nominations to, how do you handle credit cards? How do you register a will? How do you do this? How do you do that? And I found then that there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know. So I did lean on him, and I found that, my risk factor for coping badly came down quite a bit, because I had someone giving me very sound advice on how to manage the financial aspect of that bereavement. Identify and facilitate protective factors. And again, what are the protective factors? Good coping skills, their social support, communication, get them to talk, get them to express difficult emotions, and so on. And establish a channel for future support, and say, listen, if you feel like you're feeling shaky, because remember, grief happens in spikes. You might be feeling better now, but maybe a little bit down the line, you might feel again overwhelmed by your emotions. It's perfectly normal. If you feel like you need to reach out to me, please do so. Okay. Now, your goals in bereavement support is to facilitate the grieving process, to help them accept that the loss is real, to help them work through that process of grief, to offer practical support, and so on. And of course, emotional support. Stress and anxiety, and also guilt at the time. Address their practical concerns. People who sometimes have experienced a massive loss are sometimes foggy in the head. They don't know, okay, what am I supposed to do next? What am I supposed to do next? This is a good time to say, okay, you know what? Typically, if you have siblings, you need to, and if you are the person in the will or in the nomination, maybe this is the time you need to get a no objection certificate from your siblings, and you can get this paperwork in order. Things like that, because that might later on come back and bite them. Facilitate meaning making. We talked about this last time. What is the meaning? What is the meaning of this whole experience? How am I supposed to make sense of it? And I've had the benefit of having my therapist walk me through this meaning making process, saying, okay, you know what? We talked about why I got into palliative care so many years ago, whether there was a connection between that and the care that I was able to provide, etc., etc. So to really make meaning of what that experience was like, and reduce the risk of complications. Are they somebody who has a history of substance use? Are they somebody who has a history of clamming up and shutting down and not talking to other people? Okay, and promoting resilience and personal growth, because loss can either become pathological or it can help you grow from it. And it's depending on your level of expertise, depending on your facilitatory experience, you can actually help somebody navigate to a sense of personal growth, even if it takes a very, very long time. Okay, now I'm going to go through this quickly because I want to leave some time for discussion. Just like anything else, really, there are stages. Bereavement support is not just about showing up and saying, oh, I can feel how difficult this is for you, or why don't you, do you want to talk to me? there are stages at which we can offer very, very specific structured support. Okay. The first is, and again, coming at it from a palliative care perspective, when the first time you meet a family, that is your first assessment of how this family is, operating. Is there somebody there who's high risk? Is there someone there who is, not very talkative? Is there somebody there who's closer to the patient than other people? Is there somebody who is, at risk for disenfranchised grief? So is there somebody at risk for complicated grief because of XYZ reasons? They've experienced multiple losses. So your initial intake where you do the genogram and you figure out, okay, and especially if you know that the illness is terminal, this is the first time you assess them for complications, for possibility of high risk outcomes. The second time is when death is imminent. You know that this person is now starting to actively die. Okay. Now, this could be after months of the first assessment. This could be within days, depending on when this person has been brought to the palliative care unit or the end-of-life care unit. And at that time, a quick check to see how everybody in the family is doing. Okay. The day of the death, on the day the person dies, you have an assessment. Then I'm gonna take you through the steps of that assessment. 2 weeks after the death, and finally a month after the death. This is typically the framework. This is not to say that its support stops after 1 month. Depending on the kind of needs the person has, bereavement support can extend for up to a year. Now, initial intake and assessment, you are going to get these slides, so don't be too worried about how text heavy they are. Now, initially, when somebody first comes to you, you assess the caregiver's risk of complicated grief. Remember, what is their relationship to the person, how attached they are, what is the role that they play, how long have they been doing this, etc., etc. If there's an elevated risk of self-harm or current high levels of psychosocial distress, they've had to sell their house, they've had to, give up an education, they've had to give up a job, etc. And so figure out what is, to what intensity they're experiencing these things, bring in a psychologist if needed. Provide information, and this is also a chance for you to provide information and psychoeducation. And the psychoeducation is really to focus on preparing the caregiver for what the caregiving role has been. Of course, some caregivers have been at it for a while, so you're not preaching to the choir and telling you how to be a caregiver. It's not that. It's to see that, okay, in the coming days, you've done all of this. Now, this is how you can support the person best. They're getting weaker. You might find that they're withdrawing, they're not talking as much. It's okay. It's all right. You are still present as a caregiver. Outline palliative care and external services available. Some people may not know what palliative care is about. You might need to educate them on that. You have to assist the primary caregiver to support the loved one, such as in symptom management, psychosocial support. A lot of people might, they feel helpless as caregivers because they don't know, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Should I be moving them? Should I not be moving them? So, things like oral hygiene, bed care, things that will actually really help the patient at that time. Tell them how to do it or show them how to do it, because it reduces their sense of helplessness and it really gives them a way to be supportive in a meaningful way. And self-care strategies for the primary caregiver, including respite services if it is warranted. Not every caregiver wants respite. Some people are too scared to leave their loved one even for a few minutes. But maybe then to get somebody else in the room so they can at least take a nap in the same room or something of that sort. Information about death and bereavement will entirely depend on how ready they are for that. If they've had the breaking bad news conversation, things like that. So that's not, please remember, none of this is mandatory. You have to assess where the person is at, whether they're willing to have these conversations with you or not. Imminent death, see how ready the family is, if they're prepared. Is there someone in the family who's in denial? Is there somebody who has accepted that it's happening? And you need to have discussions around death decisions. Do you want this person to be at home? Okay. Now, what is the strategy here? Make sure that the family is aware that death is going to happen. We are close now to the end. Okay. Provide practical information such as signs of imminent death. Like, okay, you'll find that the person's breathing is going to change. You might find that they'll slip into deeper levels of unconsciousness. So for this, you need a medical person to be able to tell you this, depending on the illness trajectory. In my case, I was told that it's going to be a series of exacerbated breathlessness events. Any one of these breathlessness events could cause respiratory failure, which could cause cardiac arrest. That's exactly what happened. And because it had been said to me so many times in the course of my caregiving journey, when it happened, it didn't come as a shock to me. Of course, it was a shock because I wasn't there. But the actual way in which she died was not a shock, because the team had constantly told me that this is the most likely way it's going to happen. For those at risk of complicated grief, make sure there's more comprehensive support. Comprehensive support could be in the form of mobilizing family, friends, support services, and so on, saying that this person is likely to take this much worse than the others. So can we also, it's about psychoeducating the family, saying don't expect everybody to grieve in the same way. Okay. And practical decisions like who does the caregiver or the family want around? You need to make phone calls. Is there a cousin living abroad or in another part of the country? It's now time to call them. Where would you like to take them home if it's possible, or would you like them to be in a facility? Who else is to be notified? Is there relatives, neighbors, spiritual leaders? Is there anybody else that you need to inform that this is about to happen? This also helps the family come to terms with the reality that this is happening. Okay, at the time of death or as soon as possible, as practically possible. Again, you assess the level of trauma in the family. How are they handling it? Some people might have an outburst, but that's okay. That doesn't mean they're traumatized. That is just an expression of grief. But there might be others who are absolutely, who cannot handle it. Because in some unfortunate cases, no matter how much palliative care they get, the death may be difficult because of certain what we call refractory symptoms that are not controllable. There might be bleeding, there might be so many other things. And so people are traumatized by that. So assess that. Okay. Connect with social support systems who the bereaved trust, assist the family in filling out practical stuff like death certificate, application forms and things, assist them there. Ideally, at least one palliative care team member should be with the family until they have left the hospital premises. Or if it's possible, at the time of imminent death, if it is possible to do a home visit. It's not always possible, but that would be ideal. And make available either on the telephone or in person a medical person who is connected to the care of the deceased to answer any questions that the family might have about the death process. Is this what was natural? Is this are you sure she didn't suffer? Things like that. 2 weeks after the death. Why do we say 2 weeks? Because usually in the first 2 weeks, it's hectic. Family members are coming and going, different arrangements are being made, the funeral is happening. There are people coming in from different parts of the city or the country or whatever else. So 2 weeks later is when, as the crowd starts to disperse, if you've been a caregiver or care provider, call them, ask them about rituals and ceremonies. How did it go? What was it like? Inquire about other family members. You could, just by talking to them, assess their level of functionality and engagement. Someone who used to talk a lot is suddenly very monosyllabic. Share a positive memory or ask them to tell you about the person who has died, because in a lot of cultures it becomes taboo to talk about the person who has died, but here it really helps to get them to bring it up, to share some memories and so on. Offer specific practical assistance that you can follow up on. Don't say you can call me anytime. You are not going to like it if they're going to call you in the middle of your work day. You're not going to like it if they call you at 8:30 at night. So say, I'm available in the clinic for a phone call, on Wednesdays and Fridays between 4 and 6. So call me if you feel like a chat. Would you like me to visit you? I'm available on Saturday. Things like that. So very, very specific practical assistance. And if you're somebody who's not a professional and somebody who's just trying to help the family, please don't say, tell me what you need. That person is already going through enough. Don't give them one more task to think of what they want you to do. So if you know the family well enough, offer to say, take the dogs for a walk, or to take the children to a park, or to, cook some meals for their elderly parents, or whatever else. Okay. Bring up any other concerns that they may have shared with you earlier and ask how things are on that front, but only if it is appropriate. Maybe through the caregiving journey, they told you, God, I'm really worried that, at the end of it, my brother's going to come down, he's going to swoop in, and, my mother said, do not resuscitate, but then he's going to come and he's going to want to put her on the ventilator and this and that. And so there's a bit of a conflict with the sibling. How are things between you and that sibling? Are you guys okay? So those difficult sort of things that they were concerned about, or they might have been concerned about certain expenses. So if it is appropriate, if you can, ask about those. And finally, 1 month later, why 1 month later? Because finally the person is on their own and they're dealing with the secondary losses. They're dealing with role changes. Oh, I never knew how to change the light bulb or fix the car. And now I'm having to do it because it was always that other person's job to do it. And see how they've adapted. Now somebody might be a single parent. Now somebody might be an elderly person who's just lost their spouse. So their whole lifestyle has changed. They used to go for walks in the evening together. Now does she do it? So explore issues firstly around physical health, like possible insomnia, assess who they have around them as levels of support. If they sound like they are alone, lonely, don't have the kind of support they need, either give information about support groups or other community resources or link them to it. Ask landscape questions around plans to return to work. Some people who've just given up their jobs to be a caregiver, you might want to sit and talk to them about, okay, so now what are you doing with your time? Are you thinking of, taking up a job again? Or how has your office or, your colleagues been with you? Things like that. What are they currently struggling with? Roles, finances, relationships. And don't shy away from addressing the dead. Sorry, you can't see that last line. Okay. Address the person who has died, name them. Now, finally, I'm going to end with do's and don'ts when you're talking to a bereaved person. Like I just said, please don't say, call me if you need anything. It puts unnecessary pressure on them. Offer specific forms of practical support, babysitting, making an evening meal, picking up groceries, things like that. Don't avoid taking the deceased person's name. If you knew the person who died, share a nice, happy memory or an act of kindness. If you didn't know them, ask the family to tell you something about, hey, tell me a little bit about your dad. Tell me a little bit about your grandfather. Tell me a little bit about your wife, whatever. Don't rush in to say something for the sake of it. Silence is a very, very powerful tool to help somebody feel safe. And it's okay to say, you know what, I don't have the words to comfort you. I know that nothing can comfort you at this point, but I'm here for you. And I'm just going to, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to be here with you for a little while. Please don't say stuff like he or she is in a better place and that it's God's will. And this is a very, very common tendency. Those people who have experienced grief and bereavement will tell you it does not help because it diminishes their experience and their emotions. Instead, focus on the emotion, focus on them and say, I can't imagine how painful this must be for you right now. Or I can't imagine how complicated this must seem at the moment. And that, especially if you know that there's been a mess that's left behind. Avoid comparisons or telling your own story. This is their story. This is not our story, and it's not anyone else's story. Okay, so, oh yeah, but thankfully at least your loved one died in their sleep. Yeah, I know someone who, my God, they were just suffering so much and they had to be put on the ventilator and they had to. Please don't compare stories. This is not the time. So you'll have access to these slides and to a few other notes. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we will just open up the floor. We have, shockingly, Senior, we have 15 minutes for interactions. And so if I would encourage people to turn on their cameras at this point. I'd like to hear from people who haven't spoken much. Maybe if you're too shy to speak, put in a word in the chat box, put a reflection, a comment, a question, anything that has come up for you. And we have some time to go through that. Okay, I'll go to Mona's question. What was it? Is there a difference between?
Difference between grief and suffering, ma'am.
Would anyone hazard a response to this question? Is there a difference between grief and suffering?
Suffering can be of the person who is going through that particular illness, who's about to depart, and grief is probably after that thing has happened, or it's a feeling connected to that loss. Suffering can be a person who's undergoing that suffering.
Okay, but someone who grieving is also suffering if it's, or a caregiver could also be suffering quite a bit.
Yeah, so it can be the person who's still alive and who's in that state also. Matlab, it need not be, but a grief would usually be for a loss.
There's also anticipatory grief.
Yeah, this anticipative, but that's a separate category altogether. That
Anybody
helps you to cope.
Anyone else? Mona, I'm interested in the origin of that question. You want to elaborate on the question a little bit more?
Many times I feel suffering and grief are same, but other times I feel must be some difference. Something like suffering usually deals with negativity or something like that. Pain, according to palliative care, and grief is something I don't know.
No, so I wouldn't, first of all, my opinion is I wouldn't want to put them in binary categories because grief can be a terribly I mean, it can cause a lot of suffering for people, especially going through complicated grief and the people around that person who's grieving. But grief also has the potential for growth, personal growth.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in that sense, grief has, if it is managed well. But see, then again, what is the role of palliative care? Palliative care globally now, if you look at the Lancet, it says the role of palliative care is not just end-of-life care and terminal care. It is to reduce or mitigate serious health-related suffering. Okay. Now, serious health-related suffering could be financial suffering because of the illness. It could be social suffering. It could be emotional suffering. So many things. So grief has the suffering is something that our role is to reduce that suffering. But grief can be an extremely potent agent for growth and existential and spiritual growth. So I don't know if you can put either of the two into boxes and compare and contrast. I think they overlap on a lot of levels. But certainly, I have not answered your question very, in a very, I think, analytical way. But I think the two go hand in hand sometimes. But grief has the potential for growth as well. Were there any other questions? I think Rachel had one. No? Anamika, grieving is more common part of natural course of trauma survival, but suffering is a bit more pathological. Suffering, again, pathology is, I think it's a labeling word. I think that there isn't a human being amongst us who has not suffered at some point or the other, either at the hands of somebody else or at the hands of our own thought process. So I don't want to get too philosophical about this, but I would say both grief and suffering are quite common. Senior, there was a question from Rachel.
1 second, ma'am.
No, I was not having a question. But one thing what you said was correct. No, usually in our Christian this thing they say they have gone to a better place. So we also tell the same thing to the family. They have gone to a place where there's no suffering, no pain. I think today your class taught us that, taught me at least, that we shouldn't say that. So thank you, Smriti. You're able to hear me?
Yes. Thank you. I don't want to say that you should see there are people who do find comfort in words like that. But I would say choose carefully the timing of it.
Yes.
That's the thing. Choose the timing.
Yes.
You know, if maybe 5 years from now, I want to hear that and it'll give me a lot of support and comfort. But what if I'm not somebody who is religious? What if I'm not somebody who believes in an afterlife? Then that will not make sense to me, you know?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Be
Sure.
mindful of who it is you're addressing and the timing of that. Yeah, that's it.
Yes.
But
Okay.
in some cases, that might actually be a comforting thing to say to somebody. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, not directly, maybe to the person who is under bereavement. That's what I understand now. Because we have to put, when we put ourselves in their place, through this course of your lecture today, I think that's something which may cause pain, more pain to them. Yes.
It's
Okay, thank you.
it's actually speaking more of your graciousness at this moment that you're saying that. I want to also highlight the fact that sometimes we reach for the most common responses, sometimes to the point of them being cliches, because we are not equipped in the language of grief.
Yes, 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 yes,
We see like rest in peace, you know, blessed
yes, yes, yes.
whatever it might be. It's also, I think, speaks a little bit about our discomfort with death, dying, and grief.
Sure.
And
Yes.
so here again today, if you go back to the do's and don'ts, here's something, you know, like I find it so comforting, and I found this both ways when someone has done this for me, or I've seen the response when I've done this with somebody, to share a memory of that person.
That's good. Yes.
And I
Yes.
remember like people came up to me, you know, through the course of the memorials and whatever, saying, God, I remember this time that your mother said this and how much we all laughed. And it actually broke the tension of that moment because we all laughed about it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
see.
So,
Mm.
or it could be an act of kindness. Like maybe humor is not the right thing at that point. So, but if that
Yes.
you might want to point out, you know, I remember when I was struggling with this, there was a kind word that this person said to me, and I just wanted to let you know.
Yes, yes, true, true. Yes.
Or even the fact that, my God, I remember your mother's cooking. It was fantastic. I've never had a better
Okay.
cooking than that.
Uh,
So that is also the language of grief and bereavement support.
yes, yes,
And
yes. That's a good lesson, actually. Actually, when I look back, I lost my father 36 years back when I was 24. But even now, when I see or hear good words about him from his colleagues, he was teaching in a college here. So now I understand when you're telling all this. No, when we hear such good things rather than telling just blunt words. So thank you.
thank you, Rachel. Also,
Thank
I would
you.
say that that is when we presume also that the relationship between the two people was good.
Yes, yes,
What
yes.
happens if the relationship between two people is not good? So I just want to hear from somebody else also in this group. What would you say to somebody who was forced to be a caregiver? Person has died, there's been a bereavement, it was a complicated relationship. So what would you say, based on all the stuff that I've just shared with you? What would you say to somebody at that point to show that you're there in solidarity with them, but also acknowledging that it was not an easy relationship? Mona, I'll just come to your question.
If I can just share a bit in which I met someone who had a bad, like, someone within the relation who had gone ahead and had a sexual harassment done of a young that person at a younger age. Later on, he did not become a little bit more better with his deeds. He did the same thing to somebody else also, more closer in fact. So when that person was dying, the wife of that person, she asked this person that you should, like, please forgive him for whatever he did. And then she, out of whatever, like, matlab, majburi mein, she had to say ki, like, but that was a feeling of anger, like, which you just mentioned some time back. So it could be that kind of a relation also. So just wanted to share. So in that case, probably that's matlab, और कोई रास्ता नहीं है ना, अभी चला गया तो उसको माफी कर दो types. That's why.
Yeah, I think that's a very tricky territory, like to say to
Yeah.
somebody, you know, forgive. But because it's not, first of all, our place, we don't know the level of intensity of, you know, conflict that they had or whatever else. I would say that the safer thing to do then is to be with that person and say, and offer practical support at that point, to acknowledge that, you know, you don't have to say in spite of your relationship or whatever. You can say that I see that you really struggled hard to get this person the best care, you know, or that uh, it must have been a very difficult journey for you. And I just want you to know that I'm here if I can help in any way. Like, would you like me to bring across? Would you like to step out for a bit? Can I bring you a meal or whatever? Okay. Mona, when some last stage cancer patient dies after long suffering, is it okay to say they're released from suffering? Entirely depends on who you're talking to. I would say yes, it is okay to say that they have been released from suffering or their suffering has come to an end. But then I would say at a time like that, focus more on what the caregiver is going through. Very often, caregivers also, while a lot of people say, wow, you really took care of this person, it was great, etc., etc. I think it's very important for caregivers to also hear that I think given the circumstances and everything, all the resources available to you, you did what was best. Caregivers really need to hear that, especially when they're going through guilt. Should I have done this? Should I have done that? I often find myself telling families that with the kind of information and knowledge and resources available to you, you took the best decision under those conditions. Hindsight is 2020. I can always look back and say what I could have done differently. But with the kind of information and advice and resources available to you, I think you've done a fantastic job. I think you've done right by this person. So sometimes caregivers need to hear that. So to answer your question, Mona, yes, the suffering is over, but let's always focus at that point also on the living. This must have been really difficult for you.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. We have time for one or two more questions or comments before we close. Okay. Doesn't look like it. So, Sina, I think we've come to the end of the session.
I think we can wind up if there are no more questions or comments. Thank you so much all for joining for today's session. Thank you, ma'am, for agreeing for today. It was a last minute request yesterday. Thank you all. We will be having our LGBTQIA plus session, which is postponed. We'll be having it later. The session date will be shared with you soon. Thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye. Thank you, Smriti, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.